B'siyata d'shmaya, we're going to learn Pesachim Daf. We're going to start 5 lines from the top of the Amud. We're in the middle of the sugya of Chizkiah and Rabbi, and they're discussing different terms used in the Torah. Chizkiah says that whenever it says lo yeh ochel, it means that not only is the item osur ba'achila, it's also osur b'hana. Rabbi argues and says no. Whenever it says lo yoichal, lo soichal, lo soichlu, even those terms which are less strong terms, where Chizkiah would say that in those terms only mean Isser Achila and do not mean Isser Hana, Rabbi says that even those terms they mean not only Isser Achila but also Isser Hana. And now the Gemara is going to bring a number of places, a number of topics in the Torah where different terms are used, and try and see whether what we know about those parashiyos in the Torah, whether they conform with either Chizkiah or Rabbi. Says the Gemara, Mosiv Rabbi Yitzchok Nafcha. Rabbi Yitzchok Nafcha is now going to ask a question against Rabbi. Rabbi said that any time it says Lo yoichal, lo soichal, lo soichlu, it means not only Isser Achila, also Isser Hana. V'hari gid hanoshe. We know that it says in the Torah that there was a certain gid, a sinew, in one of the legs of the animal that was not allowed to be eaten by Klal Yisrael. And in that parish of Gid Hanoshe, the Rachmana Omar, that the Pasuk says, Al Kain lo yoichlu b'nei Yisrael es Gid Hanoshe. It says the term lo yoichlu es Gid Hanoshe. And according to the rules, according to Rabbi, this would mean an Isser Achila and an Isser Hana. Nonetheless, we learned in the Mishnah, Sheleach Odom Yerech Renochri. A person is allowed to send the thigh, the whole leg of the animal, to a goy, v'gid hanoshe b'soichai, even though he has not removed the gid hanoshe. And there's 2 issues here. There's one issue, maybe this goy is then going to sell it on to Yisrael, and the Yisrael will readily buy it from the goy, because this Yisrael may be aware that the goy actually bought it from a different Yisrael, and he will assume the gid hanoshe has been removed, when in truth it has not been removed. So for that we're not concerned. Why? Because it's very easy to discern whether the gid hanoshe has been removed or has not been removed. So that's just the issue of, do we have to be afraid that it's going to land up in the home of a Yisrael and he won't know the gid hanoshe is there? We're not concerned. But how about the fact that when you sell something to a guy, or you send or sell the thigh with the gid hanoshe to the goy, you're having benefit from it. Are you allowed to have benefit from the gid hanoshe? It says in the pasuk lo yoichlu, and according to Rabbi, that means Isser Hana as well. Answers the Gemara, Kosova Rabbi kashahutra nevela hi v'chelba v'gida hutra. We saw in the previous Gemara on Daf Chof Aleph that nevela is one of the exclusions. That even though it says in the pasuk lo soichlu kol nevela, you're not allowed to eat a nevela, and according to the rules, lo soichlu should mean it's also to have hana. However, the Torah there said explicitly you're allowed to have hana. You can sell it to a goy, to a geir, you can give it to a geir or a goy. A geir meaning a goy that's keeping the Zayin mitzvahs b'nei noach. So over there with nevela, it's explicit that you're allowed to have hana from the nevela. What is a nevela? A nevela is an animal that died, that was not shechted. And this nevela, actually within nevela, you've got the meat, you've got the fats, and you've got the gid hanoshe. It's all part of the nevela. So when the pasuk says you're allowed to have hana from the nevela, it was a package deal. You can have hana from all the parts of the nevela. And since you can have hana even from the gid hanoshe of the nevela, then so too you can have hana of the gid hanoshe of a tahir animal. And that's why the Mishnah says that even though the pasuk says lo soichlu, lo yoichlu b'nei Yisrael es gid hanoshe, you're not allowed to eat the gid hanoshe, nonetheless you are allowed to have hana, and therefore you're allowed to send it to a goy. Says the Gemara, There's a discussion in the Gemara whether there's any taste to these gidim, to these sinews. If you say yesh begidin b'noisen tam, that these sinews have a similar taste and texture as the flesh, as the meat of the animal, then we can understand that when nevela is mutar b'hana, so too is the gid hanoshe mutar b'hana. But if you hold that the gidim, they're just like wood, they are tasteless and they have nothing to do with the concept of the meat of the animal, then just because nevela was mutar b'hana doesn't mean that gid hanoshe is mutar b'hana. What are you going to say then? And if you do not learn from nevela that gid hanoshe is mutar b'hana, the question is, why is it mutar b'hana? If it says in the pasuk lo yoichlu, and according to Rabbi, lo yoichlu means that it's an issa b'hana. Answers the Gemara, Man shomuslei de'omar ein begidin b'noisen tam. Who is this opinion that holds that these sinews have no taste and they're not considered as meat? They don't have any taste of meat. Reb Shimon, it's Reb Shimon who holds that. Well, how do we know that? The Tanya we saw in the Brisa, ha'oichel migid hanoshe shel behemot tmea. If somebody ate the gid hanoshe of a tomei animal, Rabbi Yehuda mechayev shtayim. Rabbi Yehuda says yesh begidin b'noisen tam, and therefore the gid is part of what we call behemot tmea. So you chayev also for eating gid hanoshe, also for eating behemot tmea. Reb Shimon Peter. Reb Shimon says you're potter altogether. You're not chayev for eating behemot tmea because ein begidin b'noisen tam. It's just like wood, and it's not part of the animal. And regarding gid hanoshe, Reb Shimon holds that the Torah only said gid hanoshe was asa with a tahir animal, not with a tamei animal. So we see from here that it's Reb Shimon holds ein begidin b'noisen tam, and Reb Shimon hachanami da'asar b'hana. And Reb Shimon indeed holds that regarding a tahir animal, somebody who eats there's an issa hana for gid hanoshe, because it says in the pasuk lo yoichlu, and lo yoichlu means it's asa b'hana. And since ein begidin b'noisen tam, it's not included in the permission to have hana from nevela, and therefore indeed it's asa b'hana. The Tanya, where do we see this in the Brisa? Gid hanoshe mutar b'hana divri Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says gid hanoshe is mutar min haTorah because Rabbi Yehuda says yesh begidin b'noisen tam, and therefore it's included in nevela, and the same way as nevela is mutar b'hana, so too the gid hanoshe will be mutar b'hana. Reb Shimon Oyser. Reb Shimon says ein begidin b'noisen tam, and therefore when we allowed nevela, the gid hanoshe in the nevela was not considered as part of the meat, part of the nevela, and therefore it's also to have hana from the gid hanoshe. So that is how we've explained the gid hanoshe to work with Rabbi. Continues the Gemara. We're now asking another question. V'harei dam. There's an issa to eat, to drink blood. V'rachmona omar. The pasuk says regarding eating blood, drinking blood, Al keino martiv livnei Yisrael, kol nefesh mikem lo yisoichal dam. You're not allowed to eat blood. It says lo yisoichal. According to Chizkiah, it just means issa ba'achila. According to Rabbi, lo yisoichal means issa achila and issa hana. It should be also ba'hana, but utnan we learned in the Mishnah. Eilu ve'eilu misarvin ba'omo. The bloods of the different types of chatois, there was a chatos that was burnt, that was offered inside, or that was sprinkled inside the heichal, and there was those chatois that the blood was sprinkled in the outside mizbeach, and they would pour the remaining bloods into one of the two holes in one of the corners of the mizbeach, and then the blood would flow through those holes, would flow onto the floor of the azara, into a stream, into the Amma. Eilu ve'eilu, the two bloods, misarvim, would get mixed together, ba'ama, in the stream. V'yotzim lenachal kidrein, and they would go out to the river, to the lake, to the canal, whatever you would call it, the nachal kidrein. V'nimkorin, and they would sell it, leganonin, to the people in the garden, the gardeners, lezabil, to be used for the fields. And if they used it without paying for it, there would be an issa me'ila. So you see clearly from here that even though if you don't pay for it, you're not allowed to have benefit from it, but if you pay for it, you're allowed to have benefit from the blood of these animals. How can you have any benefit from blood at all if the pasuk by blood says that lo yisaychal dam, you're not allowed to eat blood, and Rabbi said lo yisaychal means issa b'hana? How can you have any hana from this blood? How could they use it for their fields? Answers the Gemara, Shani dam de'iskish l'mayim. Blood is different because the pasuk compares it to water. Dichsiv, it says in the pasuk, Lo yisoichalenu, also talking about a different pasuk about eating or drinking blood. The pasuk says, Lo yisoichalenu, ala oretz tishbechenu kamayim. You have to spill the blood. When you shecht an animal, you have to spill it like water. Don't eat it. Lo yisechalenu ala oretz tishbechenu kamayim. Ma mayim mutorim. In the same way as water is mutar b'hana, afdam mutar b'hana. Even though water is mutar to be drunk and blood is not mutar to be drunk, but since it's compared to water, then at least as far as hana is concerned, it's the same. Asks the Gemara that all you see in the pasuk there is that blood is compared to water. How do you know that it's water that's mutar to have hana? Maybe it's compared to water that's also to have hana. Maybe it's like the water that's been poured onto the mizbeach, and that water is also b'hana. Omer bavo kamayim. It doesn't say in the pasuk which water. It says that the blood is ala oretz tishbechenu kamayim, like water. Roiv mayim. Most waters are not waters that you put on the mizbeach. And the only time they put on the mizbeach is for in the days of Sukkot. They would put the water onto the mizbeach. Generally speaking, water is mutar b'hana, and we compare the blood to the most waters that are mutar b'hana. Asks the Gemara, Midi roiv mayim ksiv? It doesn't say ala oretz tishbechenu karoiv mayim. You should spill it onto the ground like most waters. It says like water. Water includes the water that was put on the mizbeach, and the water that was put on the mizbeach is also b'hana. It was niskadish and a kli shoris. You're not allowed to have hana from it. So maybe from the fact that the blood is compared to water is not a reason to say that the blood is mutar b'hana. Elo omer of Ashi, kamayim hanishpochim v'loi kamayim hanisochin. It says ala oret tishbechenu kamayim, spill it like water, which means the blood is compared to spillable water. So regular water is spilt. The water that was put on the nisachin, that was put on the mizbeach, it was not poured out, it was nisnasich. It was poured rather than spilt. I think the accurate way of translating it would be that nishpochim is if they're spilt, but nisachin is if they are poured. The water that's poured on the mizbeach is not spilt, it's poured onto the mizbeach. However, other waters are spilt, and since it says that you should spill the blood like water, it's compared to blood that's spilt, not to blood that is poured on the mizbeach. Asks the Gemara, but there's other blood that is spilt, and there's other waters, that are spilt, and those waters are also b'hana. If there's some waters in the world that get spilt in front of avodah zarah, that was one of the ways they would serve the avodah zarah, and they're also b'hana. So maybe when it says ala oretz tishbechenu kamayim, it means it should have the same halachas as those waters of avodah zarah which are also b'hana. Says the Gemara, Hasam nami nisuch ikri. There also we find in a pasuk that it was poured in front of the avodah zarah, it wasn't spilt in front of the avodah zarah. Nisuch ikri, it says in the pasuk, Yishtu yein nesicham, yakumu yazurchem yalechem sisra. And so we see that the water that is poured even in front of an avodah zarah is not called spilt, it's called nisuch, nesechem, nesichem, and that means it was poured, and therefore you cannot bring proof from there that it's also b'hana. So when it says in the pasuk that blood is compared to water that is spilt, it's water that's mutar b'hana. So you see from here that even though it says lo yisaychalenu, however it's mutar b'hana even according to Rabbi. Asks the Gemara, ulechizkia lemay hilchasa iskish dam lemayim. According to Rabbi, I understand why the blood is compared to water. Al ha'oretz tishbechenu kamayim, because Otherwise, it would be also to have hana from the blood. You compare it to water, and that says you're allowed to have hana from the blood. According to Chizkiah, that he learns that in any case it doesn't say lo ye'ochel, it just says lo yisechalenu. And lo yisechalenu, according to Chizkiah, means it's mutter b'hana. So according to him, I don't need the comparison of blood to water to tell me it's mutter b'hana. It's mutter on its own right, because it doesn't say lo ye'ochel. If so, why is the blood compared to water? Ulechizkiah lemay hilchasa. What halachic ramifications are there that iskish dam lemayim? Answers the Gemara, look at Rabbi Chiya bar Abba. A din of Rabbi Chiya bar Abba that we've actually had in Masechet Pesachim before. The Omer Rabbi Chiya bar Abba, Omer Rabbi Yochanan. Minayin ledam kochim she'enei machshir. How do you know that the blood of a korban does not make other food items susceptible to becoming tomei? Because we know that blood is one of the 7 liquids, that if they touch a food item, those food items are now susceptible to becoming tomei. But that's the exclusion of blood of kochim. Shenemar, it says in the pasuk, lo yisechalenu al oretz tishbechenu kamayim, that the Torah compares the blood to water that's poured out. Only blood that's allowed to be poured out and spilt onto the floor is blood which is compared to water, and that type of blood would make other food items susceptible to become tumah. However, that only dam shenishbach kamayim is machshir, she'eino nishbach kamayim. However, the blood of karbonis that you have to receive in a clay shoris and sprinkle on the mizbeach, you're not allowed to let them spill on the floor. Eino machshir. So we learn from this pasuk the comparison between the blood and the water, that blood of karbonis, which is not spilt like water, is not machshir food items to become tomei. Continues the Gemara with another topic. V'harei eiver min hachai. We know that a goy is commanded not to eat from an animal whilst the animal is still alive. T'chsev, it says in the pasuk, Rak chazak, be strong, levilti achel adam, not to eat blood, ki adam hu hanefesh, lo yiseichel hanefesh im habasa. That the blood is considered the place where the nefesh is, where the spirit of the animal is. You're not allowed to eat the nefesh, which is referring to the blood, when eating the meat. So the Gemara asks, it just says lo seichel nefesh im abasa. So according to Rabbi, lo seichel means it's also b'hana. V'tani, we learned in the Brisa, Reb Nosson Omer, minayin shelo yoshet adam kois yain lenozir ve'ever min achai lebeinei noach. How do you know you're not allowed to pass a cup of wine to a nozir? A nozir is somebody who's not allowed to drink wine. Nor are you allowed to pass Ever min achai to a goy, because a goy is not allowed to eat Ever min achai. Talmud Leimer, we learn this on the pasuk, V'lifnei iver lesitin michshel. Do not put a stumbling block in front of a blind person. So we see from here that you're not allowed to give the Ever min achai to a goy, ha'le klovim, but to give it to your dogs. Sorry, you're allowed to give your dogs Ever min achai. Now, what does it say by Ever min achai? By Ever min achai, it says loy soichel. According to Rabbi, that means it's asa b'hana. If it's asa b'hana, how can you give it to your dogs? And if you can give it to your dogs, it's clearly not asa b'hana. Answers the Gemara, Shani Ever min achai de iskish ledam. We have a pasuk that compares the Ever min achai to blood. The Chsiv, it says in the pasuk, Rak chazak levilti echoil adam. The pasuk we brought before, ki adam hu hanefesh. So you see from there that we compare the Ever min achai to the blood, and the same way as the blood we've already saw before, you're allowed to have anor from blood. From you're allowed to have anor, even though you're not allowed to eat it. So to Ever min achai, even though you're not allowed to eat it, you're allowed to have hanor from it, even though it says in the pasuk loy soichal. Now the Gemara asks, according to Chizkiah, lemay hilchasa iskash Ever min achai ledam. We saw that the Torah in the same pasuk wrote loy soichal hanefesh im abasar, which says don't eat Ever min achai, in the same pasuk as it says rak chazak levilti echoil adam ki adam hu hanefesh, don't eat blood. Why did the Torah compare it? So according to Rabbi, we know why he compared it, because it just says in the pasuk loy soichal. Loy soichal means it's osir b'hana. So we may have thought that Ever min achai is osir b'hana. So, and therefore we compare it to blood, to say in the same way as blood is mutar b'hana, so too Eiver min hachai is mutar b'hana. However, according to Chizkiah, it doesn't say lo ye'ochel, it just says lo seichel. According to Chizkiah, lo seichel always just means issa achila, not issa hana. So why do I need to compare it to blood? Answers the Gemara. Omar lecha, Chizkiah will answer you, Dam hu de'iskish le'ever min hachai. You're right, I don't need to learn from dam to Eiver min hachai, because I know that Eiver min hachai is mutar b'hana, because it just says lo soichel, it doesn't say lo ye'ochel. However, there's something that Eiver min hachai can teach to dam. Ma Eiver min hachai osur, af dam min hachai osur. That there's something that we compare, the same way as Eiver min hachai, that it's a limb from an animal that's alive, and a person transgresses the Aveira if he eats a limb from a live animal. Afdam, so too blood, min hachai, if you drink blood from an animal that's still alive, osur. It's just as osur as drinking blood from an animal that's not alive, and it carries the same punishment of korus. Ve'ezeh, what blood are we talking about that's called dam min hachai? That it's alive. It's not blood that came out of the animal after you shechted it. It's blood that the animal was still alive, and nonetheless, if you drink the blood, you're chayev. Zeh dam hakoza shanefesh yetze. It's talking about one of the 4 types of blood that come out of an animal when they let blood, and the animal actually died when this blood left it. But it's still not compared. It's not similar to regular blood. Because regular blood, first the animal is shechted and then the blood comes out. Over here, the animal only died because the blood was taken out of it. So this is called dam min hachai. It left the animal when the animal was still alive. So we need to learn out from Eiver min hachai that even though it left the animal when it was alive, it still belongs to the issa of dam, and somebody who drinks that blood is chayev korus. No less than Eiver min hachai, which is a limb that was taken from the animal when the animal was alive, and it's also to eat it. Continues the Gemara, we're asking now from another parasha, another sugya. V'harei shoyer haniskel. If you have an ox that killed somebody, and we killed the shoyer, so that shoyer is called a shoyer haniskel, a shoyer that's going to be stoned, or was stoned. Derachmona Omar, the pasuk says, "Ki yigach shoyer es ish oy es isha v'meis." If an ox gored a man or a woman and killed them, sokel shoyer, we stone the shoyer, v'lo ye'ochel, and it should not be eaten. Now, of course, if you stone the shoyer, you're not allowed to eat it. It hasn't been shechted. We're soon going to see it means if you should have stoned it and you didn't and you shechted it, you're not allowed to eat it. Lo ye'ochel es b'sorei u'bal hashoyer noki, and the bal hashoyer gets nothing from it. It's like he's lost the whole shoyer, no value from it. And over there it uses the term lo ye'ochel. Everybody agrees that should mean isser achila and isser hana. Let's see the Gemara. V'harishoyer haniskel, derachmona omar lo ye'ochel es b'sorei. V'tanya, we learned in the Braisa, mimashma shenema sokel yisokel hashoyer. From the very fact that it says you have to stone this shoyer, ein yodea shi nevela or nevela asura b'achila, then we know if you kill an animal by stoning it, it's a nevela, it's not being shechted. You're not allowed to eat a nevela. Ma talmud loima lo ye'ochel. So why did it say in the same pasuk you're not allowed to eat this dead shoyer, the stoned shoyer? Magid locha kosov. The pasuk is coming to teach us, she'im shachto, if instead of stoning it, you shechted it, la'achal shenigmar es dinoi, after it's already been concluded in Beis Din that indeed this shoyer, this ox is slated to be stoned, then also it's also to eat this shoyer. Ein li'elo ba'achila, says the Braisa. That the pasuk is only telling us lo ye'ochil, you're only allowed to. It's only also to eat the shoyer. B'hana minayin, how do you know that you're not allowed to have any benefit and hana from this shoyer? Talmud Loima says in the pasuk ubal hashoyer noki, that the owner of this shoyer is like he's cleansed from it altogether, which means that it's been totally taken away from him, that he has no benefit from it. So what do we see from there? We see from there that if not for the pasuk of Ubal Hashoyer Noki, had it only said Lo Ye'ochel, it would only be Asa B'Achila, it would not be Asa B'Hana. And that's a question both on Chizkiah and on Rabbi. And then the Brisa carries on. What do you see from Ubal Hasher Noki? My mashma, Shimon ben Zoim Oimer, Ka'odam Sha'imel Lechaverov. It's like a person says to his friend, Yotza Ploini. That individual, he was Yotza, he left Noki min Nechosov, cleaned of all his possessions. And what that means is he's lost all his possessions. So here too, when it says Ubal Hasher Noki, it means that the owner of this ox is not allowed to have any benefit or pleasure from this ox. And they don't have any benefit or pleasure whatsoever from it. So the Gemara speaks out. It's only because the pasuk says Ubal Hasher Noki that we know that the owner is not allowed to have any benefit from the sheir. Because if it would just be learned from, if it would just say lo ye'ochel and it wouldn't say Ubal Hasher Noki, Isa achila mashma, isa no loy mashma. Because lo ye'ochel only tells you you're not allowed to eat the sheir. It doesn't tell us you're not allowed to have hana from it. And this is a big question also against Chizkiah, also against Rabbi. It says lo ye'ochel. Lo ye'ochel means isa achila and isa hana. Answers the Gemara, lo'olam lo ye'ochel isa achila ve'isa hana mashma. You're right. Lo ye'ochel always means also isa achila, also isa hana. Or Baal Asher Noki, you don't need Baal Asher Noki to say that you're not allowed to have any hana from the ox itself. But you need Baal Asher Noki, which means that the owner is totally cleaned off from the animal. He has nothing from the animal. That is to Lahanoas Oiro Yuda Osa, to tell us that it's also to have any benefit, not only from the animal that I know from Lo Ye'ochel, but to tell us you're not even allowed to have benefit from the skin, which is just annexed onto the animal. Even from the skin, you're not allowed to have any hana. Baal Asher Noki. V'Yitzchok. Sol kadai techamina lo ye'ochel es besori ksiv besori in oiroi loi. If it would just say lo ye'ochel, I would know isa achila and isa hana, but I will not know that its skin is included in the isa. Komash Malon, that's why I need Ubal Asher Noki to tell us that the skin is also asa, and the skin of a shoyer haniskel, of a stoned shoyer, is not allowed to have any benefit from it. And now the Gemara asks, so lahanoch tanoyich, those tanoim, the mafkile lahai kro, that learn from Baal Asher Noki, that means that the owner of an ox is clean, meaning he's exempt of certain payments. For example, if his ox that was not a shoyer muad, it was not one that had already damaged or killed 3 times, rather it was an animal that was still relatively considered tame, and they learn the drasha achrina, they learn a different drasha, lechetzi kofer, to tell you that we know that sometimes there's a concept called kofer, that you have to pay for certain damages if you killed somebody. If this tame animal killed somebody, then we don't say that you pay chetzi kofer. You don't pay kofer at all. All the dmei velodos, if this tame ox caused a woman to miscarry, then you don't, then the owner of the shoyer is noki, is clean, he does not have to pay for those miscarried fetuses. So if you're learning Ubal Asher Noki for those halachas in the Gemara in Baba Kama Daf Mem Aleph Daf Mem Beis, Hanoas Oirei Minoluhu. So how do you learn what's the source that one's not allowed to have benefit even from the hides, from the skins of a Shoyer Haniskel? Answers the Gemara, Nafkaluhu me'es besori. We learn from the pasuk that says that you're not allowed to have lo ye'ochel es besori. You're not allowed to have benefit not only from the animal but es besori, anything that's annexed to the animal. Es always means lerabos. It means to include something, to annex something beyond the item itself. So from es besori, es hatofel besori is the skin, the hides of the animal, which are tofel to the meat, that they also have the same halachas as the shoyer haniskel, and one's not allowed to have hana from the skins. Ve'idoch, those opinions that learn from Baal Asher Noki that the skins are not allowed to have hana from, you're not allowed to benefit from the skin of the shoyer haniskel, what do they do with the word es? Answers the Gemara, es loy dorish, they don't learn that the word es comes to include something. Es Basari means the flesh of the Sheir HaNiskel and doesn't have to mean something that's annexed to it. Where do we find that there was actually a machloikas whether you learn from Es something else or not? Kedetanya, we learned in a brisa, Shimon ha'amsuni v'amri lo Nechemya ha'amsuni. It was either Shimon ha'amsuni or Nechemya ha'amsuni. Hoya he would learn kol esin shebetorah. Every time the Torah said es, it means to include something. Beyond itself, something else is annexed to it as well. Kivan sheigia, when he came to the pasuk, le'es Hashem elokechotira, you have to fear Hashem. But it says es Hashem pirish. Then he refrained, he abstained, he said, I can't say that something is annexed to the fear of Hashem. So to speak, you're supposed to have fear of Hashem and also fear of something else. That can't be. So he stopped darshaning all the S's. Omroi Talmidov, his Talmidim asked him, Rabbi, Kol esim shedarashto matahei aleim. I understand that you found an S that you could not learn from. And you understood from there that it must be that all S's are not to be learnt from, because otherwise you would have an issue with Es Hashem Elokechotira. So the S by Es Hashem Elokechotira taught him that S never means an addition. What about all the hours and toil you put into learning these Torah and learning the Esim? Omar lehen, he answered so he said to them, Kashem shekibelti schar al adrisha, exactly in the same way as I got a reward for learning these drashas and these Torahs, kachani mekabel schar al aprisha. Now that it's become clear to me that I was wrong, I'm going to get just as much reward for backing down and changing my mind, being pirish, coming away from this train of thought, from this type of drasha. So that was either Shimon Amsuni or Nechemya Amsuni, whoever it was, came to the conclusion that we're not Dorish S. That's what we said before. S, Loi Dorish. Who is darshaning S? Al-Shabor Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva came and explained the S and said, even the Es Hashem Elokechotira, we can make sense of that. V'dorash Es Hashem Elokechotira l'Rabbi's Talmidei Chachomim. There's a certain level of fear and awe that one has to have for Talmidei Chachomim, and that's learned out from the S, from something that is close to and, so to speak, an annex to the fear of Hashem, is the fear of Talmidei Chachomim. So Rabbi Akiva learns S. Rabbi Akiva learns S, so he can learn from Es Besori by Sheir HaNiskel that the hides of the Sheir HaNiskel are also Aser Bahano. Continues the Gemara with another question. V'harei Orlo. The Rachmana Omar, the Pasuk says that Kisavoyu el Horetz, when you come to Eretz Yisrael, Unatatem koleitz machal, you're going to plant, you're going to sow some fruit trees. V'araltem orlosei es pirioi. It's a double lashon. We'll soon see it's going to say it 3 times. Va'araltem orlosei es pirioi sholo yishonim. For 3 years, the fruits are considered orla. You're not allowed to eat those fruits. Sholo yishonim yeh lochem areilim lo yeh ochil. You're not allowed to eat orla fruits. So it says areilim lo yeh ochil, and yeh ochil, according to everybody, means isar achila and isar no. V'tanya, but we learned in a brisa, areilim lo yeh ochil. When it says areilim lo yeh ochil, you're not allowed to eat orla. Ein lielu isar achila. From that we only know it's asa b'achila. Minayin shelo yehena mimenu. How do you know you're not allowed to derive benefit from orla? 1. Number 2, shelo yitzba boy. How do you know you're not allowed to paint using the shells of some certain nuts? They will turn it into paints. You're not allowed to paint with the orla. V'lo yadlik bois haner, and you're not allowed to light a candle, a lamp, with the oil that was of the olives of orla, which are 3 halachas: hana, painting, and lighting. Talmud Loimat, the Gemara says, the Brisa says, that's why it says 3 times areilim, va'araltem, orlosoi, areilim lo ye'ochel. The Rabbi says kulam, to say that all those 3 are also osa. And now the Gemara explains, Tamad the kosav achmona va'araltem orlosoi areilim. It's the only way we know that you're not allowed to have anah, and you're not allowed to paint with them, and you're not allowed to light lamp with them, is because it says va'araltem orlosoi areilim. Holav hochi. If it wouldn't say that, it would just say lo ye'ochil. Hava mina, I may have thought, Issa achila mashma, issa hano loy mashma. We would have thought it's only asa b'achila, not asa b'hano. But it says lo ye'ochil, and the lo ye'ochil according to everybody, chizkiya and rebavo, it means not to eat nor to have hano. And that seems to be contradicted in this brisa. Answers the Gemara, La'olam lo ye'ochil mashma. No. Lo ye'ochil by Orlo says not only that you're not allowed to eat it, but also you're not allowed to have benefit from it. Bein issa achila, bein issa hana. V'shani hasam d'chsiv lochem. It says in the pasuk, it says there, Shalei shonim hiye lochem areilim lo ye'ochil. What does it mean that it should be for you and don't eat it? We would have thought that Yitzchok sol kedai techamin ahoil v'kosav lochem shelochem yehei. I may have thought that even though it's lo ye'ochil, you mustn't eat it, it's still lochem, you're allowed to have benefit from it because it says lochem komash malon. That's why I need the araltim or lose arelim to tell us that lochem is not there to teach you that you're allowed to have anah from it and you're not allowed to have anah from it. Says the Gemara, okay, so once we have Araltam or Lose Arelim to tell us you're not allowed to have Anah, then what's the Lochem going to teach us? Lochem Lomoli. Answers the Gemara, look at the Tanya. In the following brisa, we're going to learn something from Lochem. Lochem lerabois es hanotua lerabim. Lochem tells us that even a tree that was not planted for a private purpose, for a private person, it was planted for the public, and I'm in the middle of the road. It was planted to serve the public. I may have thought that in that case there's no Isav Orla. That's why I need Lochem to tell us no, even if it was planted for you, for the public, it's also the halachas of Orla apply. That's the Tanakam in the Brisa. Rabbi Yehuda says from Lochem you learn something else. The Issa of Orla only applies when it's for you as an individual. But Lahoitzi es hanatua l'rabim, and to exclude a tree that was planted for the public, if it was planted for the public, then the halachas of Orla do not apply. So either way, we use the Lochem to teach us something about the trees that were planted for the public. My Talmud the Tanakama. What's the reasoning of the Tanakama who learns from Lochem that it comes to include that even a tree of the Rabbim has an Issa Orla? Because it says in the Pasuk, Unetatem, it says V'chisavoyu el oretz, Unetatem kol eitz machol. When it says Unetatem, it means that you will plant, you will sow. Le'yochid mashma, le'Rabbim loy mashma. It would seem from the word Unetatem that the Issa of Orla only applies for your own private plants. If you planted something for your own private use, there's the Issa of Orla. Therefore, Kosav Rachmona Lochem, that's why the Pasuk adds on that Sholei Shonim Yeh Lochem, to say Lahovias Anatur Larabim, to add on and say no, even if it was for the public, the halachas of Orla apply. Rabbi Yehuda learns differently. Rabbi Yehuda says, Unetatem, the word Unetatem, mashma, bein l'rabim, bein liyochid. Any fruit tree that was planted, there's an Orla applies to it. So why does it say Lochem? Lochem, v'lochem, bein yochid, bein rabim, mashma. Lochem also means, irrespective of whether you planted it for yourselves, for private purposes, personal use, or you planted it for public use. Why do I need twice to say an inclusion? Unetatem includes even for the public. Lochem includes even for the public. When you have twice an inclusion, one after the other, have a ribui achar ribui. When you have two such ribuyim, one after the other, ein ribui achar ribui elo lemait. When you have twice a ribui, it's actually coming to teach us that something's being excluded. What's being excluded? That's what Rabbi Yehuda says, that the Lochem is coming to exclude, or the second ribui is coming to exclude, that a tree that was planted not for personal use, it was planted for the Rabbim, the halachas of Orla will not apply. In Yirtzeh Hashem, in the next Shiur, we're going to continue with the next question from Truma.